Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the sixth of a series of presentations and discussions on technology and responsibility. I'm Thanasi Moulakis, the director of the Herbst Program of Humanities, which has been established in this college thanks to the goodwill of its brilliant alums. The most important thing that we do is a valuable purpose in itself, that is to say, provide engineering students with the opportunity to broaden their horizons in such a way that they understand the cultural and social parameters of what is their professional calling. It is in this context that the program itself, which, as most of you know, consists of small text-based discussion classes, and which has so far entered its third year, with what I say with a certain amount of pride, great success, is that it also has a number of offshoots, a number of spin-offs, including this series on technology and responsibility, which we were able to conduct with the sponsorship or the co-sponsorship of the President's Fund for the Humanities and with the help of the School of Engineering as such. This is the sixth of a number of such presentations, as I mentioned at the beginning. It is an ongoing affair, and I'm very pleased to tell you that it will continue in the fall with, again, brilliant speakers and with the active participation of our audience. Our first session discussed professional education in the exam in life. The second session, engineering education and managerial responsibility. The third session was ethics and the ethics of arms manufacture. Technology and environmental responsibility was the theme of our fourth session. Our fifth session dealt with professional ethics in engineering. This one aims at technology and political responsibility. It sounds, in a way, like a theme which juxtaposes two things. And there again, I would like to say that I am particularly pleased to be as much of a bridge as I can of things that actually belong together. I think that these polarities are exaggerated in force. It is very often the case that technology is seen as something here and society there, and then people try to establish relationships between them or oppositions between them. The truth is, of course, that we are talking about things that belong necessarily together. There is no such thing as a non-technological society anymore. There's no such thing as a technology that happens independently of social consequences and social presuppositions. I think it is equally extreme to speak of an autonomous technology, that this is a technology that has taken off on its own, although there are undoubtedly certain things that have a pattern of their own, a determination of their own. But if in fact we were nothing but puppets at the end of some determinism, then there would be no point at all in talking about politics and technology, and would be particularly wasteful to bother to elect anybody to make decisions for us if all that happened was, as it were, some inner determination of an implacable machine. On the other hand, it is perhaps an exaggeration to pretend that we are simply autonomous human beings in which we use technology freely for chosen purposes without any presuppositions or any other things. On the other hand, a certain modicum of freedom is elementary if we are to speak of responsibility with any meaning at all. It is easy for many of us, those who are in the technical or in the business field, to consider politics in that light, because we always think of things more or less as a matter of administration, that is to say, of finding the best way of achieving ends that we take to be desirable. And we accuse a great many of our politicians that they don't do things the way we like them done. And I think one of the things that we tend to underestimate is that a great part of what politics is the peaceful accommodation of interests and arriving at properly, how shall I say, legitimate decisions as to what is desirable rather than merely the means towards already predetermined ends. I'm therefore particularly pleased to be able to present to you two speakers who have both, in different ways, a leadership role in combining, as it were, these things that, in my opinion, belong essentially together, namely technology and political responsibility. We have first Representative David Skaggs, who is the closest thing to something that has disappeared. As you know, in the olden days, when not only numbers were represented, but also intelligence and thought, that it was thought, rightly or wrongly, that universities represented that. And at that point, Oxford and Cambridge University each had a member of parliament. This, in the meanwhile, has been overrun, but we have the next best thing here in Boulder, namely our own congressman. So I am delighted to introduce Congressman Skaggs, who is not only our own congressman, as I say, but also he is on the Appropriations Committee of Congress, and he is on a subcommittee for water and energy. So he is, in many ways, not only as our direct representative, but also as a member of the preparing committees in the decision-making body, extremely well qualified to speak in these things. I'm particularly grateful that he agreed to join us in an election year, knowing how precious his timing in these days, and I welcome him with the warmest sentiments. The other man who's going to speak to us is familiar to most. He is our own dean, and he is a man whom we all know as the dean, which means that we mostly don't know very much about him. We generally go to him with our complaints or our claims, and I would like to point out just a few things about his career. He took his first 2 degrees at Princeton before taking his PhD at Cornell. He is an aerospace engineer, and along with his many distinctions, the membership of scientific academies, he has a particularly rare distinction. Not only has he served as an advisor to NASA, but he has the even more rare distinction of having actually resigned from that role on principle. I would also like to point out, simply without going into great detail, that he is still a very active aerospace engineer and has recently been awarded the Max Planck Research Award for work that he has done in the field of his professional specialization. I don't want to waste any more time, and I will immediately pass the word to Dean Seabass.
The introduction that noted that I had resigned from a committee at NASA comes as a surprise to me. It's as surprising as the invitation I got from the Chancellor yesterday in the mail honoring my retirement. There's no doubt a message there. It is April 15th. Your taxes are due. Be responsible. Don't test technology. File a return. Last week I was in Palm Springs for a meeting of a group of engineering deans. The mayor of Palm Springs is Sonny Bono. The signs all around Palm Springs say, Sonny Bono's the answer, because he's running for the Senate. If Sonny Bono's the answer, it's got to be a mighty peculiar question. Engineers bear heavy responsibility, and too frequently of late we have seen evidence that their professional ethics may be on the wane. How else can you explain one engineer asking another, quote, take off your engineering hat and put on your managerial hat, end quote, to reach a decision that we all know was wrong. But despite these shortcomings, a recent poll of senior executives ranked engineers the highest among their professional colleagues in ethics. When asked, what profession do you trust the most? 34% said engineers, 17% said CPAs, a surprising 17% said doctors, 8% said lawyers, 7% said dentists, 1% said investment bankers. Either they didn't include or they didn't ask about politicians. The body that accredits our educational programs has a code of ethics. Every one of the faculty here are members of professional societies. The students are student members of those societies. Those too have professional ethics. But in academia, we do little, if anything, to inculcate ethics in our students. Our senior seminar, Management, Ethics, and Leadership for the Real World, is under-enrolled and underappreciated by the individual academic disciplines, as Lanny Pinchak knows, as he ran it for three years. The credentials of the people that come to that leadership seminar are extraordinary. They're captains of industry, large and small. They deal with ethical questions every day, and they bring valuable insights to a very small group of students. Some might call what we do for our students in ethics short and shallow, and that would be a generous comment. But speaking of short and shallow, that's what George Bush said. It's going to be short and shallow. We thought he meant the recession. Turned out he was talking about his economic policy. My colleague here today, David Skaggs, and I too, by the way, like to blame the Reagan-Bush years for an economic policy that had the following impact. If you look what happened to real income, that is income minus inflation, over the period of time from 1977 to 1989, it went up 8%. But for the middle fifth, it went down 5%. For the working poor, it went down 10%. For the upper 1%, it went up 100%. And the upper 0.2%, it went up 700%. And so while David and I might like to blame the Reagan-Bush era, I do have to remind David we had a Democratic Congress during all those years. So.
No, we didn't.
No, didn't we? Good.
They have the Senate.
Okay. But as Josh Billings once said, live within your income, even if you have to borrow to do it. And I would add, you're probably going to have to borrow from a Republican. Most of what we do in engineering entails risk and benefit, so I thought I'd spend just a few minutes on risk and benefit. There is a lesson to be learned there. Generally, if you make a product or a process that involves risk to those that make it and risk to those that use it, and if you want to make the risk low, then the cost is high. In other words, if we can do this, I've never done this before, but yes. If you look at cost and risk, high cost, low risk, high risk, high risk, did I do that right? Yes. This is low safety, low cost, high safety, high cost. So where do you decide when you're going to, where do you decide what the risk level is? Well, in most products, that's decided by secondary factors. Secondary factors that have to do with what is the liability if it's not safe. And generally, these secondary factors do something like this. So this is a primary, and this is a secondary factor. A better chart of that, and it's actually a pretty good example, is that one. For one, let me just talk about one product in that regard. For general aviation, the expense of defending yourselves against the lawsuits and paying off the liability claims for general aviation aircraft is about equal to the cost of aircraft and pricing them. That is, this is about right. The primary cost and the secondary cost add up to be the cost of a general aviation airplane, half of which is the cost of being prepared for the liability of producing such aircraft, and that essentially establishes the risk level of such a technology. The question is, who's responsible for that risk, the product or the user? There's a big debate about who's responsible for that, but if you look at commercial aircraft to get some idea of how much of the liability resides in the product and how much resides in the user. And there are very few commercial aircraft that crash because the product was faulty. Largely it's a pilot error. So if you use that same frequency of cost for general aviation aircraft, then you conclude that the reason that they're unsafe is because of the people that are flying them. And of course the factor of safety in general aviation aircraft is about 10 times worse than that of commercial aircraft. Unless a doctor's flying the airplane, then it's 100 times worse. Well, of course, it is that secondary market that provides income for lawyers that have not become politicians. And so that reminds me of another article that I read in Business Week. The previous data came from U.S. News and World Report, and we want to advertise everybody on this program. So the April 6th issue of Business Week's cover story has an article that says if you doubled the number of graduates in engineering each year, you would increase the domestic product by 0.5% a year. On the other hand, if you doubled the number of graduates from our law schools, then you would decrease the gross domestic product 0.3% a year. So all I can say, roughly speaking, if you cut law and law graduates to a quarter of their current level, it would be the same thing as maintaining the current level of engineering enrollment. We might as well do that, so let's go do it. Speaking of risk, Dan Quayle made a risk-benefit analysis recently. I think he got the wrong answer. He was being interviewed about the current world and economic situation. He was proffered 1 or 2 sound bites, a very short period of time on the evening news. He thought for a moment and weighed the risk of saying something stupid versus the benefit of being on the evening news. He took the risk and thoughtfully replied concerning the current world situation, "It has never been so much like it is before." Let me say a little bit about leadership and responsibility. 80 years ago this month, an invincible ship set sail from New York. So invincible was that ship that a lifeboat capacity was only 25% of the passenger and crew capacity of 3,550. Fortunately, there were only 2,227 passengers on the Titanic on that voyage. And when it struck the iceberg, 1,522 people died, and 705 were saved by the lifeboats that were available. And that's a leadership decision. A leadership decision to say this boat is unsinkable. I doubt that it was made by an engineer, but boy, I wouldn't want anybody to go do the homework because they might be wrong. The process for making 2 popular pesticides involves a chemical that the chemical engineers know how to pronounce, but I think it's called methyl isocyanate, manufactured in this country under very stringent safety controls. That process was exported in 1980s to India. There are seats up here, don't hesitate to come up front. It was exported to India. In that process, the safety controls were not exported. The Indian government insisted that all the plant be run by Indians, and things were safe for a while until Union Carbide decided that they could no longer afford to pay their people to supervise the safety of that plant, and they relinquished control of it to inexperienced managers, resulting in 3,000 deaths, 10,000 disabilities, and 100,000 people injured. On January 27th, 1986, one of our alums, Ellison Anazuka, was killed when the Challenger exploded over just a minute into its maiden voyage. NASA and Morton Thiokol management overrode the unanimous vote of 14 engineers not to launch in those cold temperatures because they were very concerned about the integrity of the O-ring seals at temperatures of 38 degrees. That decision was again a leadership decision, and it cost the lives of 7 people, including a school teacher who was only on board because the NASA had decided that the shuttle was a safe vehicle and civilians should fly on it. But I remember a committee on which I served, and I did not resign from that committee, which advised the NASA that we felt there was a very high probability that at least one of the first 4 shuttles would crash in operations, given the high number of components and the low level of reliability in some of them. I think the one that I'd like to conclude, though, with 2 more points. One is I think there's an ethics of vast projects that we have to look into, because there's too much going on in the world today that I would call, this is a vast project, and it's based on a half-vast idea. I happen to think the space shuttle was a good example of that. I'm sure there are people in this room, probably a majority of people, that will disagree with me. It was argued that the space shuttle would be the only economic way to get all the things we had to get to orbit, and besides, the nice thing about it was we would have men on it, and we'd need them there too. Well, of course, we know in retrospect that the space shuttle has not proven to be economic. We knew in retrospect that, in fact, the process of getting there actually kept us from launching space vehicles for 2 years. But let me assure you, we knew in prospect, too, that the space shuttle was not an economic way of getting things to space. There was a view at the time that NASA would be better if it were bigger, and what is good as NASA is good for the country, and that view prevailed despite the arguments of many to the contrary. But speaking of space, in Palm Springs I was having dinner with a group of deans, and one of the deans from California said, "I believe Jerry Brown is the best person on this planet to be president." To which we thoughtfully replied, "Perhaps, but he's so seldom here." The core SDI concept of an X-ray pump nuclear laser, nuclear pumped X-ray laser, and the National Aerospace Planes are similar vast concepts, vast projects based on half-assed ideas. Perhaps the worst, though, is the proliferation of nuclear warheads for our long-standing defense policy known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. I do have a chart to show with that. The single dot in the center of that chart represents all the explosive power invested in World War II. Not just the 2 explosions of nuclear weapons in Japan, but all the explosive power in World War II. The rest of the dots represent the combined arsenals of the U.S. and the former USSR in terms of nuclear warheads. I don't know if you can see it, but this little circle up here represents the capabilities of a single Polaris submarine. We have at least 30 Polaris submarines in the fleet. And the capabilities down here in the lower left-hand corner are the capabilities of a single advanced Titan submarine. This capability of this single submarine is 8 times the explosive power of all of World War II. So I think that we really have to take into account of something that's terribly overbuilt. The statement that was made in the press in the debate about Rocky Flats that we need plutonium triggers for the re-engineered nuclear warheads that we have, ignored the fact that we're so overbuilt in the capability to mutually destroy one another that was absolutely ridiculous. We also have to worry about the warnings of the scientists about global warming and about ozone depletion. These two may be warnings based on very little substance. We do have to worry about the CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. We do have to worry about the depletion of the ozone by the fluorocarbons in the stratosphere. But my own guess at the moment is the hype in the newspaper is way, way out ahead of the science, and we better be careful about that. NASA is now raising the specter of an asteroid impact. 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years from now, it's going to happen, no doubt about that. But when you compare that risk versus the fact of the explosive firepower that's on this planet now, I say we better pay attention to the current problems we have at hand. Let me simply conclude by talking about distinguished engineers in public service. There is a cry for more engineers to participate in public service. The most recent example of an engineer in public service, at least a highly placed engineer, is John Sununu. Arrogant and brilliant, they said. Arrogant, I'm sure, but his engineering was never brilliant. I know that too. He also lacked good judgment on other matters. A better example, a contrary example, is Jimmy Carter, our last Democratic president. While his economic policies may have left something to be desired, his foreign policy was highly principled and highly successful. His reputation, badly damaged at the time by the U.S. hostages taken by Iran, continues to gain luster, and I believe he will go down as one of the great presidents because of his foreign policy. The only other engineer who became president also had serious economic difficulties. He became president in time for the Depression, Herbert Hoover. He was a highly valued engineer, known as a humanitarian for his relief efforts, and he was also highly principled. And I think what he writes about engineering in his memoirs is worth quoting. Herbert Hoover writes about engineering, "It is a great profession. There is a fascination of watching the figment of the imagination emerge through the field of science to a plan on paper. Then it moves to realization in stone or metal or energy. Then it brings jobs to men. Then it elevates the standard of living and adds to the comforts of life. That is the engineer's high privilege." But he continues, "The great liability of the engineer compared to men of other professions is that his works are out in the open where all can see them. He cannot bury them like the doctors. He cannot argue them into thin air. He cannot, like the politicians, screen his shortcomings by blaming opponents and hope that people will forget. The engineer simply cannot deny that he did it. If his works do not work, he is damned. And perhaps for this reason, and despite the lack of any formal education on our part in ethics, the engineer, when separated from vast projects, remains reliable, trustworthy, and responsible." Thank you. I got my licks at the attorneys. It's now David Skaggs' turn.
Thank you very much, Dick. And I'm glad the survey you cited stopped short of rating politicians. I also thank you for the kind introduction. I noticed the figure of speech closest thing to leaves a lot of for interpolation, so thank you. Glad to be here this afternoon. I'm also nervous about a camera that can look at my notes. That's,
David, it won't show your notes.
good. It's a real privacy issue. You know? I have no idea how to work this into my talk, but since Dick has established the precedent of political jokes for the presentation this afternoon, at least I have to get one off my chest, which at least a couple of you heard Saturday night at another occasion. But Garrison Keillor on his show Saturday reminded us that the source of human intelligence is broccoli. That's it for me. The topic of technology and political responsibility, believe it or not, is something that I've spent a little bit of time thinking about it, even dating back to my undergraduate days, where I was allowed, at least temporarily, to shape a policy or a program of study, rather, that was more or less one designed to get at the question of science and society. That was in 1962, and those kinds of notions were somewhat less in vogue then, I think, than they may be now. When I got to Congress 5 years ago, I went after a seat on the Science and Technology Committee for a number of different reasons. This university and its interests were certainly central among them, but it was also a forum in which I thought I could participate in the ongoing public debate about some of the more technical issues that face us as a country and a planet, and where I hoped I would be effective in fostering support for laboratory work across the country in the public sector and the private sector here at the university that depended on federal funding and was a key ingredient, I thought, in defining our future. And I've worked hard over this period of time, in particular, to make sure that we did what we could to reach in to the laboratory and make sure that especially the activities of research that were funded with public dollars ended up being brought whenever possible into practical application to the benefit of society. My position now on the Energy and Water Subcommittee of Appropriations is another venue in which to, I hope, play some role in both empowering science and cajoling the Congress into addressing this cross-cut question of political responsibility and technology. The sort of seminal event in my brief undergraduate dalliance with a science and society major came from the presence, while I was a freshman in school, of C.P. Snow as a visiting scholar at the school I was attending at the time. And I thought I might take as a text for this afternoon, or at least set up as a straw man, some observations that Snow made now almost 35 years ago in the essay that's probably familiar to many of you, The Two Cultures. And he observes here, constantly I felt I was moving among two groups, comparable in intelligence, identical in race, not grossly different in social origin, earning about the same incomes, who had almost ceased to communicate at all, who in intellectual, moral, and psychological climate had so little in common that instead of going from Burlington House or South Kensington to Chelsea, one might have crossed an ocean. In fact, one had traveled much further than across an ocean, because after a few thousand Atlantic miles, one found Greenwich Village talking precisely the same language as Chelsea, and both having about as much communication with MIT as though the scientists spoke nothing but Tibetan. That at least captured at that moment in the late 50s a sense of how poorly we were doing in terms of Western civilizations melding technology and political responsibility, at least as one dimension of the humanities. I want to start with an example from my own experience before really getting into the topic in a way that I hope will be useful for discussion later on. And that had to do with an incident involving the Rocky Flats plant that cropped up shortly after I first took office in Congress in 1987. Many of you will recall that the Department of Energy at that time had proposed installing what was called a fluidized bed incinerator as a device that would be used to benignly reduce mixed radioactive and toxic wastes into an ash that could be relatively safely disposed of compared to the problems we faced with dealing with those wastes in more conventional ways. That proposal was made public, and not surprisingly, the rafters shook with the shouts coming out of the public surrounding the plant that the idea of burning radioactive waste in an incinerator was an absolutely intolerable proposition and was to be opposed at all cost. Let me plant that memory with you, for those of you for whom it's a memory, and if you weren't around in those days, just to think about what I would set up as a kind of instance in which a highly technological proposal became the subject of intense public policy debate in what we hope remains a functioning democratic society. So I want to come back to that in a few minutes. I think it's important to start out with a couple of definitions, at least operational definitions for me. I'm not sure that they'll pass academic muster, but that's for you to judge. What do we mean by political responsibility, to start with? In my mind, that has to do with some sense of accountability, a willingness anyway to accept accountability by broadly construed governmental mechanisms, whether it's a legislature or a regulatory official or whatever. And really the same notion, but seeing that the responsible parties are extended way beyond just the governmental players themselves to individuals and firms in their private role, whether as private citizens or private businesses. Anyway, the notion of accountability for actions that have public impacts. I think also important, although it may be a real excess of care to try to define technology in an audience of engineers, but I needed to go through the exercise anyway. And at least what it means to me is a sense of applied science, the practical application of scientific discovery that is made usable either through governmental or commercial engineering, either through the public sector or the private sector. It also has for me, and I think in the context in which I'm going to be speaking this afternoon, sort of implicit in it the notion of complexity, of something that is inherently elusive to the average educated person, and one toward which such persons, as Snow suggested, even may have a certain hostility toward understanding. All of this, I acknowledge to begin with, commits the sin of oversimplification, of setting up too easy polarities for the discussion. I realize the truth is a lot fuzzier than all of that, but it helps me get into the subject anyway. Political responsibility, separate of any overlay of technology, implies a political judgment being made. How do those judgments get made, especially in a democracy, is what is on my mind in dealing with the question of political responsibility and technology in our particular political environment. Who makes judgments in this sense? They are made, first of all, by those engaged in technology. I will probably not attempt to say very much about that because I'm not in a fit place to understand or observe carefully about it. But I think it's important to realize a couple of components in that category of those who are engaged in doing technology, if you will. The talent, that is the persons that are employed at it, the scientists and engineers, and I think the sources of funding, whether it be governmental funding, private business, universities, but the talent and the financial resources to put the talent to task. Judgments, political judgments about technology are also made by those affected by technological activity, the people generally, and those of us in politics who are representatives of the people generally. And I'd like to play out those two different subsets of political judgment makers as seems useful to me anyway in understanding where we are headed here. The private, that is, those that are engaged in doing technology, and the public, those of us who are in either society generally or in a representative capacity in society. And the economic models that enter into our judgments depending upon which the private or the public side of the fence we fall on. I think for those on the private side, both the talent and those providing the capital to employ the talent, we have tended to look at technology in terms of internal costs, internal to the enterprise, whether it's academic research, commercial research, government research, questions of funding, of raw materials, of talent, labor. Basically, the variables that are used in free market analysis. Those of us that are on the public side of political judgments about technology, political responsibility about technology, tend to have a different economic model to apply to the task, one that is concerned with external costs, for instance, pollution, social costs and benefits, and instead of free markets necessarily, although we don't ignore those, markets that are, when necessary, regulated or taxed, that is, in which there are efforts to intercede in behalf of something beyond those things identified through internal costs. Again, carrying out sort of the political economics of those economic models. On the private side, we have tended to be concerned primarily with short-term economic growth, with immediate economic advantage, with convenience, with national security, or firm security, depending upon whether you're talking about the private or the governmental side. On the public side of that paradigm, looking at things that are involved in external costs and social costs, we are more likely to look at long-term growth issues, resource sustainability issues, intergenerational economic implications as opposed to immediate economic advantage questions, ecological sustainability as opposed to convenience, and international security as opposed to national security. Again, obviously, the polarities are not always absolutely valid, but I want to give you a sense of what I'm trying to get at here. I think the evolution of our economic and political thinking over the last 20 to 30 years, pushed especially by the environmental movement, has been to shift our tendency to analyze these questions from that private side of internal costs, shorter-term thinking, to the public side concerned more with externalities and future implications. And that, in that sense, the dialectic that Snow set up 30 plus years ago has started to fade. Having established that framework, and I hope it's not too strained a construct, how do those engaged in doing technology see their political responsibility to others? That is, how do they worry about the externalities of their work? And the second complementary piece of the issue, it seems to me, is how do those of us in the rest of society see our political responsibility toward technology, that is, our understanding of the internalities of that work and its consequences for democratic government. I don't know much about the first of those pieces, but let me share with you a few thoughts about the second. That is, how do the rest of us in society deal with technology, and what does that mean for our country? If we're going to have a functioning democracy, it depends upon informed and thoughtful decisions made by an informed and thoughtful electorate. It follows that if we're going to have a functioning democracy vis-a-vis technical or technological issues, we must have an electorate that is informed and thoughtful about technical matters. That sets up, in my mind, a further dialectic between technical literacy or technological literacy and technological prejudice. We will need to strive toward technological literacy if we're going to have any hope for a functioning democracy to apply itself to technological issues. My fear and belief is that we are now stuck, more often than not, in a condition of technological prejudice. To get to literacy, we need information, and for a population like ours, that means information from the media as opposed to misinformation. We need a level of interest and ability within the population at large to deal with technological information. That requires education. And we need some time for reflection on all of that, which, as an ironic result of an ever more technological world, seems to be lacking in most of our lives. We also need interest groups that are more interested in rational outcomes than irrational outcomes, and political leadership that is willing to insist on a high quality of information and interaction in order to get to politically responsible judgments about technological matters. That kind of democratically formed judgment or value assessment about technological issues facing our society is what will ultimately inform some kind of operational ethic for us as a people. But given the tendency that we now have to rely on the television and market-driven media practices to inform our people, and playing essentially to their prejudices, it is hard to be particularly optimistic about a breakthrough from technological prejudice to technological literacy. And I am equally cautious about what the next generation holds, given what we know about the quality of our educational system in K through 12 in the areas of mathematics and science. On the other hand, I think that we have recognized that we have a fundamental problem in this area as a society, and certainly that recognition is the first step toward finding some kind of solution. I spent too much time, I'm afraid, on a fairly theoretical argument, and I want to go back to that example I cited for you at the very beginning, the fluidized bed incinerator. What happened after the public uproar over that proposal by the Department of Energy was that we were able to put together a coalition of local communities surrounding the plant who funded a panel of experts, scientists and engineers and epidemiologists, who applied both expertise and patience to an analysis of this proposal by the Department of Energy, with the explicit direction to make that analysis accessible to the public, to the average person in this part of Colorado. And what transpired over a period of some weeks and months was a proposal coming out of that expert panel for a technically sound approach for the Department of Energy to take to test out and validate its assumptions about this troubling proposal, and a shift in the public's attitude toward it from the more irrational to the more rational, as we were able to take some of the volatility out of the public debate. It was, I think, an interesting example of what can happen when people of goodwill choose to apply their intelligence to become more technologically literate, to do it in a way that is available to the public generally through a decent effort by the media to make difficult information understandable, and then the application of the best spirit of our democracy to try to work its way through to a reasoned, technological, politically responsible judgment. The challenges that loom ahead for us in areas of a very heavy technological component loom ahead for us as a people, as a functioning democracy, are really pretty daunting, whether it's SDI and whether we're going to spend billions and billions more there of our scarce resources, requires people in public office to be able to make very complicated technological, politically responsible judgments, and to be able to translate that to constituencies so that they understand how their government is operating. Whether we're talking about the world population explosion and the consequences of that for the planet long term, and how we again get a democratic society to put aside its technological prejudices and embrace some kind of technological literacy so that we can have a democracy that can make meaningful decisions about world population growth or energy policy or genetic engineering or you name it. It is startling to me as someone in public office how many of the absolutely central issues facing us as a people and as a planet come back to, as I say, a component of technological significance that we are simply going to have to do better at translating to our people, to having a people that can understand and engage in meaningful dialogue with elected officials and go through the mechanics of a democratic decision-making that will enable us as a democracy to hold true to our ideals of a public shaping of public policy. I believe that there is now a much greater degree of cross-cultural sensibility than C.P. Snow suggested to us over 30 years ago, that science and the humanities are talking to each other more and understanding each other better, and that they ultimately see an imperative of technologically sophisticated politics and politically sophisticated technology. We remain a long way, however, from the level of technological literacy that should make us comfortable that our democracy can function well in dealing with those very momentous issues that are just on the horizon. However, as Snow himself observed in the same essay I started out with, there is only one way out of all of this. It is, of course, by rethinking our education. I hope we can make some progress on that this afternoon. Thank you very much.
I'm back, ladies and gentlemen, to give you some more misinformation about who is in and who is out. In a moment we will be able to open the discussion to the floor, and I would like, before we proceed to that, to ask our speakers, whom I thank very sincerely for their papers and remarks, whether there is something they want to say to each other before we...
Only that the Republicans controlled the Senate from 1981 to 1986.
My error on that. That's true. Shows you how ill-informed us technologists are. David, I might just make one comment following up on your remarks that political responsibility means accountability. Suppose we tried in the federal government a tack of trying to hold agencies accountable in terms of what they promise. That is, you say to an agency, yes, you say you're going to do this, and we're going to judge you on your performance. And if you don't make it, or it costs too much to make it, if you miss less, then your budget's going to be different in the future. Now, we know there are future things that have to be done, that somebody has to do. But we'll just have to find some other agency to do it, because you don't seem to be able to do it right. It seems to me in some of the agencies in Washington, they are not being held accountable in any regard for a very bad performance. A way the industry would be held accountable to a much greater degree than agencies. How do you put that in place?
Excellent question. I think part of the problem derives from the lack of accountability of those who are trying to hold the agencies accountable. That it's sort of a meta accountability problem, and really the division of responsibility there between internal executive branch oversight, which doesn't get conducted particularly well, and congressional oversight, which is really always intended to be a kind of backstop to internal executive branch oversight. But we've gone through a period, as you know, of so-called regulatory reform, in which the hallmark of success was, in some areas anyway, of agency activity, their letting go, and it's difficult to measure sometimes what exactly the objectives were and whether or not they were obtained. We also have an inherently confused situation at the federal level right now because of the division of government between the two parties and the executive and the legislative branches, and that has further muddled the success that either has had in holding agency action to account. I think you need to sort of pick out real concrete examples. I mean, I can and do endorse what you've suggested in concept, but I think, for instance, of particular programs, let's say Department of Agriculture commodity programs. We in fact do have reasonably good measures on whether or not those succeed as planned in keeping prices where they are supposed to be and keeping farmers solvent. They tend not to do that very efficiently, but they are there. I would ask you, I guess, to give me something more to work with in that, what kinds of agencies doing what kinds of things are we trying to measure? It is.
Well, yeah. I'll give you an example. Yeah. I would say, NASA, based on your performance with the space shuttle, you're not in the space station business. We want to do it. We have to find somebody else to do it. Now, that may be the wrong way to try and fix the agencies, but something's got to be done. By the way, I do believe that there is great advice out there for Congress on some of these issues. All of the advice NASA got, unlike the Air Force, is in the public domain. But the Air Force is somewhat different than that. I once served on a committee, Thanasi didn't mention, I've advised the Air Force about it half as long as I advised NASA, and the committee was put together by a general of the Air Force, and it was under this is a general that flew airplanes, and it was under a general committee, was chaired by a general from the ballistic missile fleet. And there were half a dozen of us on the committee, and the general who was going to conduct a study called us in. He said, "We've got to know, gentlemen, what the answer is to the close air support of troops on the ground in the near term. We do not know when there's going to be a conflagration in Europe or in the Mid-East, and we need to have that answer. And here's your charter, and here's a blank check. Go get me the best answer. I need to know." And this committee was about to walk out the door, and just as we were all six of us lined up to go out the door, he said, "Oh, by the way, the right answer is the F-16. Now, we worked for 2 years, even though we knew the right answer, we got the wrong one. We concluded that it was a re-engined A-10. We even found the engine to re-engine the A-10 with. And we delivered that report to the Air Force it of course did not appear. Yeah, I am told, I don't know if it's true, but I'm told if the Army hadn't been in charge of the Gulf War, the A-10 would not have been used. It does not look good in air shows.
Let me pose one question to you, Dick. If I heard your remarks correctly, it struck me that there was almost it was an article of faith that those who have gotten through an engineering curriculum would be imbued with a sense of what the right thing to do was in difficult circumstances. It was not entirely clear what the logical connections were that got us to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And I want to believe that you're right, whether it's with Herbert Hoover or Jimmy Carter or others. But you seemed less concerned about the lack of enrollment in your ethics courses because somehow it was going to turn out all right anyway.
No, I misled you.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know why. I believe it turns out well, but there's no logical rationale for that.
Okay.
And I believe that it would turn out better if we really did our job as educators in the ethics area. And I believe we're derelict in our responsibility in that regard. But over the years in all these committees that I served on, they were largely populated by senior executives from business, the aerospace business. And I found these gentlemen highly ethical. I remember one morning after sleeping on the floor of the Red Carpet Club in Washington, D.C., because my plane was snowed in, I woke up in the morning to get in line to go get on another airplane out of Denver, and I ran into in the line president of the aircraft company that had the National Aerospace Plane contract. And you know what he said to me? He says, those goddamn zealots are going to ruin this program. They don't have any idea what they're trying to do. He knows what they were trying to do was wrong. I've really found very high integrity among the aerospace executives on these issues. Anecdotal.
Mm-hmm.
That dovetails with the question I wanted to ask. There's been, for Mr. Skaggs, it's been impacted this community lately. You've been talking about, both of you have been talking about accountability and the technical expertise that this country used to have a reputation for being one of the most remarkable technical arenas in the world. The recent situation here in Boulder with the NIS-NOAA expansion, I realize that's not technological in the way of putting space planes into orbit, but in the ensuing debate, GSA got involved in designing this building. I won't get into the issue of a process because you're probably more than familiar with that problem. They conceded after a lot of arguing and wrangling that the design was then better than it was when they first started. I think they begrudgingly conceded that because they rather resented anyone daring to hold them accountable in the first place. I'm just wondering, why. For example, I'd heard comments being made that if the local entities had been allowed to work this out for themselves, sort of on a more community-arranged basis, obviously they still had to meet the specifications of the project, but in other words, the Washington loop wasn't part of the process. The whole thing would have been a much more of a public relations success and resulted in a better facility anyway that would have been more amenable to the community at large. I'm a little disappointed. I think this issue of accountability came up with the cities approving the project prior to the full agreement being worked out, whatever. And to many people in this community, even the agreement was at fault. but that, as it may be, I'm just wondering, you got all these people involved who, I certainly not an expert in this, but I mean the city council members, I don't think they'd know a building. I mean the new city libraries, the floor plan, that's a minor disaster. I mean that's trivial compared with, and I'm just wondering whether the problem is that the wrong people get involved, there's sort of an arrogance, there's a kind of too many egos at work, people aren't willing to use the mental resources that are available in this country, and I just kind of wonder what the problem is in this country. I mean, the potential must be amazing, and yet for some reason it just keeps floundering and floundering and floundering. And
Well, let me...
You're more the expert on this than I am, that's for sure.
What you see depends on where you sit. In fact, in my opinion, I shouldn't say in fact, in my judgment, the experience with the NOAA NIST building will be seen to have been a landmark success. It is because Congress, at my request, imposed on the federal agencies involved the requirement that they sit down and deal with the local community, something that heretofore had been virtually off limits in GSA and federal building projects, that we had any kind of engagement between GSA, NOAA, and NIST and city planning authorities. Absent that directive from Congress that thou shalt talk to local entities, we wouldn't have had the dialogue that existed. Admittedly, it was awkward and occasionally not a pretty thing to behold, but it was the first time that I'm aware of that anything like that had been undertaken in dealing with a major federal building project in a community like this. It's ironic that we are talking about this issue here on state property, which has always been totally immune from any intrusion by the local city government as to its heights, breadths, depths, or open spaces. So if you want to look at, who's coming up to the plate to try to be responsive and responsible to community values, the federal government made an awkward but I think very important effort to do that in this instance. But the agencies involved weren't used to it. They had to be pushed to it, and I think not surprisingly, the process that unfolded wasn't neat or pretty, but I think ultimately had some real successes.
The term technological literacy got used a lot earlier this afternoon, and I was just wondering from both of your perspectives, what does that mean in terms of the kind of education you give a person, not so much at the K-12 level, which may be the ultimate position, but at the undergraduate college level. We can define what an engineer is, we can define what a non-engineer is, somebody who is below technological literacy. How do you achieve this happy medium? What is that medium?
To me, it means that it should be an essential part of any liberal arts core curriculum requirement, and I guess core curriculum requirements are maybe coming back into acceptance. A sufficient exposure to rigorous scientific and mathematic instruction that a graduate comes away with some ability in their future adult life to be able to work their way through not the most sophisticated technical matter, but certainly that which is going to be essential in these areas that I very briefly sketched out to having a functioning democracy decide what its future is going to be.
I actually, Howard, believe that you really need to have people understand what the scientific method is. Now it really requires statistics and when something has some validity from a scientific point of view. But I believe you can teach that in the high schools. It's not, but I don't believe you need to go to colleges to do that. A chemical engineering department here does offer a course in what you might call technological literacy, but I think we really have to look at those courses and say, are we doing what's important? People have to understand scientific method, they have to understand statistics. And generally that's enough. But very few people do. We don't even have a requirement that our engineers graduate from this college. No statistics.
There's an organization in Boulder which is a proponent of telephone voting. I was wondering if both of you could comment on the feasibility and the implications of telephone voting.
I happen to believe that telephone voting, except in rare cases, is likely to lead us down a very seductive but ultimately counterproductive path. It assumes, it seems to me, the proposition that is contrary to the underlying logic of representative government, which is that most legislative choices involve familiarity with some nuances and subtleties of complicated issues that are accessible if you spend a lot of time at it and put your mind to it, but are basically delegated to elected representatives to do that with, and aren't presumed to be easily within the grasp of everybody in the country. So you've got a choice to make. Either you homogenize your political decision-making to the point where it really is accessible to everyone in the country and lose the subtlety, and maybe that's a good thing. I don't know that most modern problems lend themselves to a least common denominator kind of formulation such that broad, popular, small d, democratic government in a non-representative way is likely to produce very good results. I don't mean that, although it may sound elitist or something. It's just trying to be as objective about analyzing what really goes on in trying to make public policy decisions.
Let me follow up on that by a somewhat different concept. If you take one step back from telephone voting, you can do telephone polling. We're polling for the public opinion on this issue. Dial 301-786-5411 to vote no, and 5412 to vote yes. That way we can have instant national surveys of public opinion. By that method, the politicians can always follow public opinion. But we need politicians to lead public opinion. We need leaders, not followers, and I think the current problem is we've got too many people following public opinion and very few people trying to lead it.
Basically, I agree with you that that underlying many of our public policy problems are science-based technology issues that we haven't addressed in that way. But I would, I guess, disagree with you a little bit on a local variation of the two cultures argument. It turns out that on this campus we don't have, in the history department, anyone who specializes in the history of science or the history of technology. We don't have people in the literature, in English literature, so far as I know, who are able to take what writers have said in the way of imaginative fantasy and relate that to, teach that to the students and begin to develop a core of understanding from the humanistic side of what science and technology are doing to society. And it seems to me that, like much of the rest of the culture, what we've allowed to happen is not only the two cultures thing, as my example on the campus I think illustrates, but also even within some of these specializations we don't have much communication. That is to say, if you look inside the engineering department, I suspect there may be some difficulty of communication across various, aerospace, for example, and chemical and various others. And so it seems to me that what the university needs to do in the way of education these days is to begin to organize those intersections among different fields. And that we're not doing very well. And what tends to happen when the decisions are made and the resources are allocated is that the traditional parts are reinforced in those intersections where much of the mileage is, I think, for our students and for dealing with policy issues tends to get lost. And so this is a comment and a suggestion, and perhaps Dean Seabass would like to comment on the educational aspect. Is there anything that really can be done realistically at CU Boulder to get, for instance, the historians to hire an historian of science and technology and so forth, and to get those people in touch with people down on this side of the campus.
About half my career was spent at another institution where there was a very active interchange of ideas between the scientists and the humanists. There was a program in science called STS, Science, Technology, and Society. Involved Nobel laureates and Pulitzer Prize winners, among other people, as the faculty. And I am disappointed, like you, on this campus. I think we have not built that intersection between the humanities and the science that we should. And it might be a good place to build because we're very strong in the sciences. And to be then very strong in the humanistic part of the sciences, like the history of science, would be a very good thing to do. But I'm not the person to answer whether that's a reasonable prospect for this campus any more than you are.
Let me add one other thing. In the National Science Foundation, there is a small program that's supposed to deal with this intersection. And the last time I looked, it's about $2 million per year, which is relatively small compared to an agency that I think is up to about $2.5 billion in rough terms these days. And that, I think, is an indication of how little regard there is for beginning to meld the technology with the needs as clarified and worked out by historians, humanists, and others.
Do you comment?
Well, I defer to your assessment of what things are like on this campus right now. I do have a sense that, generally speaking, we've made some significant progress in getting disciplines to talk to each other better, more places than was the case, say, in the 50s when Snow was writing his complaint. Heaven knows there's a long ways to go, which I guess was really, in part, my proposition saying we're falling way short in terms of technological literacy generally.
I have a question for Congressman Skaggs. When an individual congressman or a committee of the Congress is dealing with a issue, whether it be a new program being advocated by an agency of the federal government or a new law which is going to involve regulating environmental whatever it is, but an issue that is technologically based, where do you seek your advice, unbiased advice? In other words, you don't go to the advocate, of course, because that'll be a biased set of advice. And I'm particularly curious about the role that you see the National Academies playing, as well as the Office of Technology Assessment, which was created several years ago, as you know, to deal with that problem that you and your colleagues face.
Well, both OTA and the National Academies, both science and engineering, are really the courts of first resort on the big technology public policy questions. But the reality or the practicality of it is that there are a limited number of occasions in which we can tap into that expertise. OTA is a significant agency, but is limited in its resources and the number of research tasks it can take on for us. The National Academies the same way. So when we have NAS or OTA reports on things, they tend to be very major items in the debate and in controlling the debate, but there's a whole raft of sort of second-tier issues that never reach that level of expert analysis, in which we're left with, not that it is second-rate science or engineering by any means, but it sort of has less of the imprimatur of a major government entity behind it. That may be a plus. So, you're looking at studies that have been carried out by other professional societies, sometimes by serious academics that are not part of the immediate debate. Sometimes the Library of Science has expertise that can be brought in on a more limited way. So it's a real smorgasbord of resources.
But isn't it true that in many cases you have to rely upon your own personal judgment? Isn't that fair? In some of those, yeah.
Ultimately, that's where we come down on most of it. It is rare that we get sort of unanimity in the scientific or technical community that said this is the obvious choice. Whether it's on the National Aerospace plane, as self-evident as it may be to Dick, that that's a real dog, or whether to build the W-88 warhead. So yes, and it is for that reason that again I get back to the importance of having both some level of technical competence in the Congress and an ability for us to talk to the people that we represent about these questions, because in a way that can be understandable.
Let me just comment on something David said. What I said about the National Aerospace plane is true as the program was originally conceived, but it's largely been redefined by industry, and now it's much more on target.
Good.
But industry had to redefine it. Okay.
Doesn't this really raise the question of what the congressman raised earlier, that is to say, the question of democratic decision-making in technical matters? And since it seems evident that simply what is popular is not what is truly desirable, the one solution that I heard being intimated was that everybody should be so literate that at the grassroots, as it were, technical decisions can be made. Now, this seems to me, well, to underestimate the complexity of what true technical problems pose, so that raises the further question of the institutionalization of the kind of advice that should be served. It also suggests that the literacy, which I think is frightfully important, should really be of the kind of whether you can tell good advice from bad, rather than be able to make up your mind in I mean, I don't think that just learning the second law of thermodynamics, as the late
and that's not so easy either.
is going to solve the kind of problems that we are confronted with.
No, I think you put it very well, and I was not meaning if I did suggest that we ought to have a level of understanding in the population at large that would enable them to make independent judgments about these things, but to have at least a level of understanding about scientific method, about the importance of a rationally based decision making in these areas, so that leadership is possible, that you can have some kind of informed discussion between elected and electorate about some of these complex matters, and a sense of respect for a technically based decision making scheme that isn't totally alien to the grassroots.
Yeah, Dean Seabass, you pointed out quite well, I think, on the nuclear weapons that we have, the quantities of destructive ability on it, and also we, of course, have all the delivery systems associated with that. But this has taken an awful lot of engineers to put this together, the scientific engineering talent to construct it. It's used a very large portion of our research budget in the country on it. And I wonder, looking back, seeing what we have now, whether you'd have any suggestions or thoughts on maybe what we did wrong in education, or what we didn't do in education and engineering education, that so many engineers have been willing to work on this and have never said a word, or very few.
Well, my closing remarks had one caveat in them about the ability of engineers to be responsible, and that is, I said, when separated from vast projects. I think in this thing, it was a project that, in fact, unless you saw the whole, and that didn't require an engineer, unless you saw and added this up sensibly, does this make sense? Then I think many people would conclude it didn't. But there were many people who would conclude, oh, absolutely, it didn't make sense. But I don't think it was a failure of engineering education that did that. I think it's mainly a failure of the system to keep asking those questions. Is this right? How many times do we need to mutually destroy one another? Well, maybe all these warheads won't get through. I mean, there was a rational process in there that was more political than a technical process.
That's right.
That did not intervene. And I would say that there were engineers out there. There were quite vocal on that subject.
Sorry, there was one more question I could not suppress, and then I think your schedules are such that we will have to perhaps...
I think perhaps Congressman Skaggs put it well when he was stating that essentially there's a lack of understanding of scientific method, but actually its limitations in problem solving, that in contradistinction to what Dean Seabass was saying. While it's certainly true that much of the public is not familiar with scientific method and its usefulness, many in the engineering community, the scientific community, and the public at large are unaware of the limited nature of the scientific method for policy making. And a case in point would be the current debate going over right now with global warming and the greenhouse effect, in that certainly through scientific method we can determine certain probabilities of what may or may not happen, but because of the complex nature of the problem, we can only come up with certain probabilities, and it is then not left to scientific method to make a decision on this, but more of a value-based judgment as of if we were to make certain shifts in our emissions of carbon dioxide, for instance, what would that mean in possibly preventing a disaster or possibly not doing anything? And is that worth it to go ahead and make those changes if it's not going to bring about catastrophic economic decline and actually may bring about a positive outlook? And it's that failure to understand where and when the scientific method is important. And I think often in leadership positions, there is a sort of mysticism attached to the engineer or the scientist as being an expert in all areas. And far too often, while they may be a specialist in their one area and understand that well, they are often sorely lacking in an understanding of other fields related to it or into societal implications. And that, I think, is a critical problem that is facing our nation.
You
It's
put
a
it...
good application of the scientific method to the question you asked.
No, you are very persuasive, put it well, and I think we do need to be on guard against sort of putting too much faith in the abilities of the technical community to figure it all out. And there certainly is a sort of mythology abroad, part of the technological prejudice that you're more omniscient than you are.
Let me just respond in talking about what people need to know about scientific method. I failed to mention something that you made clear in your remarks, and that is you have to understand the system as a whole, and that's the hard part. And many of these systems involve things that don't have anything to do with technology.
It is my unpleasant but nevertheless binding duty to close these procedures. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you for participating. Thank you, Congressman Skaggs. Thank you, Dean Seabass.
Thank you very much.